Welcome to this online lecture for Modern Latin America. Today we're going to look at what happens in Latin America after independence is won. As always, there are some terms at the top and some names that you should be able to identify by the time this lecture is over. So, let's get to it. On May 19, 1822, Agustin de Iturbide was crowned Emperor of Mexico. Iturbide was the former Spanish military officer who had fought against independence, but sensing an opportunity he switched sides and convinced Mexico to name him emperor. But Iturbide's power was not unlimited. Mexico had a constitution that declared that the emperor had to share power with an elected Congress. This made him a constitutional monarch. But Iturbide did not like sharing power, and so he dissolved Congress, or, to put it another way, he fired Congress and attempted to rule on his own. Iturbide's actions led to an open revolt. In December of 1822, a military officer by the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna rose up in rebellion against the emperor. Iturbide sent an army to capture Santa Anna, but instead of putting down the revolt, the army officers actually joined Santa Anna's cause. Iturbide could read the writing on the wall. On March 19, 1823, less than a year after he took the throne, he abdicated and gave up his throne. He and his family fled to England, but not for long. In 1824, Iturbide returned to Mexico. He was convinced that Spain planned to invade and reconquer the country, and he claimed that he had returned to offer his military expertise. Unfortunately for him, he was immediately detained, and on July 19, 1824, he was executed by a firing squad on the charge of treason. With Iturbide out of the way, Mexico's brief experiment in monarchy ended. From here on, its history would be dominated by two forces: liberalism and conservatism. But it was not just Mexico that was torn by these forces. Across Latin America, the newly freed nations struggled to determine their futures. That's going to be the story that we're going to tell in this lecture. Let's start with liberalism. The push to overthrow Iturbide began with liberals. But before we can figure out what that meant, we need to understand a simple thing. What is liberalism? In short, liberalism simply means the people rule themselves. The model for liberals was the United States. The Constitution of the U.S. gave significant power to the people, and that was something liberals in Latin America wanted to emulate. Thus, after independence, they wrote liberal constitutions that were much like the U.S. Constitution. That meant things like equality of all before the law, the abolition of special privileges for elites, and representative government. Now, these are radical ideas, especially in Latin America. Why? Remember how colonial Latin American societies were organized. There was no such thing as equality. Instead, rights and privileges were determined by a racial caste system. Moreover, there were special privileges granted for the peninsulars. Finally, power was highly centralized in the viceroyalty. In other words, liberalism was going to be a hard sell in Spain's former colonies. Despite the liberal constitutions, however, and the rights granted to the people, there were some warning signs that a liberal society might not take root. For one thing, many of these governments were created with a strong president who could dominate the new government, much as the viceroys had done. Moreover, wealth and power was still concentrated in the hands of elites in Latin American society. Moreover, many elites, including some liberals, harbored suspicions about the poor. They remembered the massacres of peninsulars and Creoles at Guanajuato and Guadalajara under Hidalgo. Thus, support for maintaining the rights of this segment of the population was weak. Thus, within 20 years of independence, conservative elites had reasserted their power. They abandoned the liberal constitutions and adopted new ones that stripped the poor of their voting rights. They also restored special privileges for the rich and for elites. But this period was about more than simply liberalism and conservatism. There was also a new phenomenon on the scene that came on the scene. That phenomenon was known as the caudillo. A caudillo was a dictator or strongman. In many cases, their power was merely regional. This was a result of the continuing division between fringe and urban within Latin American nations. Thus, a caudillo might command, a town or even a state that was far from the national capital. In other cases, however, a caudillo might rise to dominate an entire country. So where did caudillos get their power? Well, quite often it came from the military. Many caudillos were former military leaders who had fought in the war for independence from Spain. But military power was only one part of the equation. Many caudillos were also very charismatic, and they ruled through their personality. In other words, they were charming, and the people loved them. So why did the people love them, or at least why did they support them? Well, first of all, many caudillos were typically conservative, and their supporters were typically conservative elites as well. And they liked the fact that caudillos promised to keep order in society and to maintain the peace. This meant that the status quo would be maintained. You would have no more revolutions of mestizos and poor. There would be no more massacres of peninsulars and Creoles. The caudillos' primary role is to keep order. Now, caudillos based their support on a number of institutions within Latin American society. One group were the wealthy landowners. These were often the Creoles who had fought the war for independence. Caudillos won their support by promising not to interfere with their control of the economy. The rich would stay rich under the rule of a caudillo. They also promised to protect the power and the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church, probably the most powerful institution in all of Latin America after independence was won. The church was very conservative, and it supported caudillos because they promised, again, to maintain order. Another source of caudillo support was the army. Now remember, as I said earlier, caudillos were often former war heroes from the wars for independence. Thus they were able to use their reputation to build support within the army. But perhaps ironically, another source of support for some caudillos were the poor. This was due to their ability, the caudillos' ability, I should say, to manipulate the public with their charisma and charm. They often offered relief and promised gifts for the poor. In this way, they provided for the poor much like a father provided for his children. Caudillos existed throughout Latin America. I'm going to run through just a few of them here. For example, Argentina, through much of the 19th century, was dominated by a caudillo by the name of Juan Manuel de Rosas. In Central America, you had Rafael Carrera of Guatemala. And perhaps the best example of a caudillo was Antonio López de Santa Anna of Mexico. We've met him before. Remember? He was the guy who helped to overthrow Iturbide. So what have we learned? Well, first of all, we've seen that independence equaled instability in most Latin American nations. The statistics seem to bear this out. Between 1820, the time of independence, and 1970, there were about 180 to 190 constitutions throughout Latin America. In other words, there were new governments popping up all the time. That's the definition of instability. We have also seen that one of the reasons for this instability lay in the battle between liberals and conservatives. Each had a very different vision of the future, and those clashing visions made it hard to govern consistently. Finally, we have seen that in the midst of this instability, many Latin American nations were willing to turn power over to a strongman or dictator. In other words, the caudillo.